Yeah. LA, my understanding, is a 50-50 pass-through. I intend in Oakland also to be 50-50. San Francisco allows 100% pass-through to the tenants with some overall cap, but it's still a lot more than these other two cities, which could mean why that is why the property owners are more willing to do it, because they could pass it almost all on to the tenants. Unfortunately, at least in Oakland, that our tenants could bear that cost. That would cause a tremendous displacement. And so we are not only having them pass on only half of it, but we're going to amortize that over 20 years. And so to kind of take the edge off the rent increase.
Yeah, that was actually the biggest sticking point in passing that legislation was the rental pass-through, and it is also amortized over many years in San Francisco, and there's a hardship waivers, and it's a rather complicated process.
Yeah, and I guess there's rather elaborate, or the hardship waivers are potentially going to be showing up quite a bit for the tenants.
Dr. Jones, wanted to go back to, I think, the second or third slide you had on the economic repercussions, and you were comparing Nashville and New Orleans.
Yeah.
And you talked about the continuous loss of $15 billion a year. Can you be a little more specific about that?
You can barely see it the way the color came through. So Nashville, it's a very light line at the top of that shaded area, and that's just the Nashville GDP versus time, and then New Orleans GDP versus time. And what we're trying to see is that before the hurricane, New Orleans was a bit larger than Nashville. New Orleans is at 66 to 70 billion a year, and Nashville's down at about 68 before this. After the earthquake, or after the hurricane, now by 2012, Nashville's GDP is at almost $80 billion a year, and New Orleans is down at 65. So I'm just saying that they're nearby, they're a few hundred miles apart, responding to the same regional economy. If we could extrapolate that New Orleans should have adjusted to regional economic issues about like Nashville through this time period, then we would have expected New Orleans to be having a GDP 15 billion a year larger than what it actually has now. And it's tied to a population decrease. You know, the population was 500,000 people before the hurricane and went down to less than half that for a while, and it's now at about 350,000.
So if you were going to apply that to cities in California or Los Angeles, what estimate would you put it at? Even though I've heard some before, but what ongoing estimate would you put on an annual basis as well?
Well, I think it's something on the order of 10-20% in a drop in GDP is what we've seen in Nashville. In New Orleans, it's what we've seen in Christchurch. Christchurch, I have data on the population, and it's lost 18% of the population of Christchurch. Actually, I was just in Tohoku, Japan, and northeast Japan, where the magnitude 9 hit, and with the areas affected by the tsunami. The worst affected community is about half the size it was before the tsunami. Now, they literally lost 10% of their population in the event itself, but they've lost another 40% that has just moved out because it's too miserable living there. So I think we're talking about losing on the order, it's very easy to imagine losing 20% the population. And what does that do to the regional economy? And if we lose, 14,000 rent stabilized apartments, if most of those are gone, we're losing, well over 100,000. I think it's about 130,000 housing units represented in those soft first-story buildings. Now, we presumably don't lose all of them. It depends upon the earthquake and exactly what areas are shaken.
So without putting you on the spot, would you give a ballpark figure? Would you be able to put a...
I would think most of in the biggest earthquakes, most of the rent-stabilized apartments will be lost in soft first-story buildings. Right? Our estimate, we had 1,500 complete collapses for Southern California. Most of those are concrete buildings, and that's maybe 10% of the inventory. So those are the sort of ballparks, and it all depends upon exactly which earthquake and exactly which shaking and which time of day, and do we set off the fire? If it happens during a Santa Ana, we could lose everything.
Okay. Thank you all very much.
Thank you
for being here. What I'd like to do is break up the next panel discussing the state's role. And what I'd like to do is have the California Department of Housing and Community Development, as well as the Seismic Safety Commission, as well as the California Department of Insurance come up. And in this panel, we'll talk about the varying roles that the state plays in seismic safety. And then what we'll do is we'll continue the discussion with the other three state departments afterwards. Mr. Kraus and Mr. Hyper.
Thank you. John Hyper, Department of Housing and Community Development. I'm the Acting Chief Deputy Director, and this is Kyle Kraus, the manager of the state's Housing Law Program. What I'd like to do is break our presentation into three short parts. First, discuss HCD's role in managing the establishment of building codes, provide a high-level summary of significant building code changes related to seismic safety, and then lastly, provide a snapshot of how HCD's housing portfolio relates to perceived earthquake risks. So first, HCD is required by state law to adopt building standards that align with the latest edition of the National Model Codes. And the latest National Model Codes are developed and published by the International Code Council. So this provides the basis or foundation for establishing California's building codes. The California Building Codes requires buildings to be designed and constructed to safely support loads. And I had to ask my staff to define some of these, such as dead loads, live loads, snow loads, wind loads, rain loads, flood loads, and earthquake loads, so earthquake safety. And the building code contains seismic hazard maps, which identify ground motion values for California and the entire United States based upon known faults, seismic activity, and soil conditions as well. And so California building standards may include any amendments made by the department, but they cannot be less stringent. So in other words, we can adjust the building code, we can make it stronger, but we can't make it less stringent. And as we heard earlier, local governing bodies may adopt more stringent requirements based upon local seismic conditions or perceived earthquake risk. The code contains appendices which are available for local adoption, which provide prescriptive options for addressing factors, including seismic strengthening or seismic retrofitting. And so local governing bodies do have the authority to mandate local seismic strengthening programs to address risk in buildings with such as buildings that have soft stories, unreinforced masonry, and single-family dwellings that are at risk. HCD is aware that many cities in high seismic areas have adopted local seismic retrofit ordinances and have mandated retrofits of unreinforced masonry and soft story buildings. So to provide a summary of changes to the building codes at a very high level, in 1927, that was the first edition of the Uniform Building Code, and that kind of surprised me because the house I grew up in was prior to 1927. So that was a little surprising to me. And then in 1941, building departments were first required by the state law to provide a review of plans and issue building permits. Moving forward to 1976, the building code required additional resistance to lateral loads, so earthquake, wind, and this includes shear walls, reinforced concrete, reinforced masonry, and wood-framed shear walls. So we're starting to see some progress in terms of the building codes. In 1986, there was the California Unreinforced Masonry Law, which required 365 local governments, predominantly in San Francisco, LA, and San Diego, to perform an inventory of unreinforced masonry buildings and then establish a loss reduction program which would address not only the buildings but also to assess and mitigate losses in terms of how it would affect people as well. In 1991, there were statewide code adoptions for evaluations of retrofits and unreinforced masonry, and subsequent incremental changes strengthening of the building codes again in 94, 97, 2007. So we took a look at the multifamily portfolio for HCD and using standard data that we can find in the state's hazard mitigation plan, and based on the information that we had on our projects, for about 1,000 awards for multifamily projects since 1979, we discovered that about half of those were in areas that we perceived to be at a very high risk of damage for a significant earthquake. So if there's a significant earthquake, we determined about half of those would be subject to significant damage, and naturally those are located in areas where the state has the highest concentration of population, the Bay Area in Los Angeles and the San Bernardino region. We discovered about 62% of our awards were made after 1991. So why that is significant, so first we wanted to take a look at what our total awards were and where they were located geographically in terms of where the greatest risk was. So the first step was, well, we've discovered about half of them are in high-risk areas. We also discovered about 62% of our awards were made after 1991. And why that is significant is because the building codes have changed incrementally since 1991, so we would perceive those awards to be at a lower risk because of the strengthened building codes. This also indicates that about 38% of the portfolio was built before that date, and building codes were not as strong. So one would assume that those would be at a higher exposure for damage resulting from earthquakes. So in conclusion, what I wanted to point out is HCD proposes the adoption of building code standards based upon the model building codes, and these codes address local seismic hazards. And local governments can and do go further to assess their risks, and they address these risks through local ordinances and seismic retrofit programs. And looking at our housing portfolio, we did determine that a high percentage of our portfolio of affordable housing, about half, we perceive to be at risk. Now, having said that, I'd like to say that we are not seismologists, and we did conduct our analysis consistent with the state's hazard mitigation plan. And given additional time and working with other state agencies, we would perform a more thorough analysis. But I just want to put some context around our study that we did find about half of our portfolio is located in these areas where the greatest risk of earthquake damage would be.
Thank you. Questions? Comments? What I'd also like to add is, going forward, if we can focus on also addressing the questions of what the state's role is. You are all here, all the 6 agencies who are here are going to be conducting work, have a piece of this issue. But what I want to hear is also what the state's role is, and also who's in charge, in a brute way of saying it a little bit, because unfortunately we hear about these wonderful programs. Most of them are lost on our constituents because they're not aware of it, and we need to expend dollars to actually get the word out on the proactive end. But then at a time of a catastrophe, what happens exactly? And how does the state step in prior to the catastrophe in really taking charge of making sure that we're covered and we're prepared? So please, if you can elaborate a little bit on these 2 points as well as you're making your presentation, I'd be interested to get your feedback. Thank you.
Do you want me to add?
Mr. McCarthy?
Good afternoon. So let me ad-lib a couple of things for you here. It's been a long time since the last bad earthquake. so it's difficult to get that message to resonate with the public because they've got lives. So all of us here, I know, are involved in trying to keep that issue alive in the public and the legislature and the governor's office as well. And I have to admit it's difficult because we don't have, without the lack of a bad earthquake or an earthquake that makes a statement, I'm going to talk to one about the Napa earthquake, it's tough to keep it alive. So we spend a lot of time trying to keep it alive. So let me give you some examples and try and answer some of your questions here as I remember. The commission, to give you an example, the commission is made up of 15 appointees by the governor, and they represent different areas of expertise. We also have one assembly member, Ken Cooley, one state senator, Senator Cannella, and we have 3 state departments on our commission, Cal OES, the state architect, and the Building Standards Commission. So that gives us kind of a broad base into the public window, into the legislature and the governor's office on the earthquake issue. All right, it's a small commission, but it's produced many cost-effective projects that reduce the risk to the people of California, and we try and do this cost-effectively through partnerships. We partner with state and federal government, we partner with universities and business and industry, and I'm pleased to say we partner with the majority of your speakers that you have on the agenda here. That way it keeps us working together for projects that are of value. We support usable projects. We don't do just basic research. I'm going to give you some examples of that. All right, Dr. Jones mentioned as an example, I'm going to talk about this in a second, about the usability of buildings after an event. So let me go into some specific examples here that we found in some of our work. If you ask most of the public what is the greatest industry, the largest industry in California, they'll tell you Silicon Valley or the movie industry. And that's not true. It's agriculture. And agriculture has been kind of left out of the package and not used to being, shall we say, they have not been educated as much as to what their risks are. So we undertook a study with UC Ag Center to reach out to agriculture. We included poultry, livestock, and dairy industries in that. And so for our role, as we've identified them, that their distribution centers are most vulnerable, such as slaughterhouses and canneries and refrigerating facilities, and they're also vulnerable at port areas. If port areas go down, they're going to lose a lot. Our food supply is going to be impacted. Now, Dr. Jones mentioned the earthquake in Tohoku. We couldn't even ship food supplies to Japan because they couldn't refrigerate it once it landed there. So we have kind of a symbiotic relationship with other nations as well. Another issue we tried to do with Small Business Development Center, we contracted them and worked with GoBiz to develop a business recovery guide for small businesses that was done by business for business. And what they did was they utilized lessons learned from Katrina and Sandy and other disasters around the country to put together a package, a document that would tell businesses what to do, where they can go for assistance after an earthquake. And we've recommended they keep a paper copy of this somewhere in a safe or waterproof safe in their businesses, because it's an easy to follow guide to where they can get some financial help and other help as well. Dr. Jones, let me follow up on what you were saying on the building issue. We supported partnered with on a 5-story shake table test for a hospital in UC San Diego, and we shook it at different levels of earthquake shaking. And there was in that building was emergency room, hospital facilities, beds, nurses' stations, and so we shook it at different levels of shaking. And after that, we set the 3rd floor on fire. And what our concern then is, for example, if this building were to be shaken at some point, it's going to have damage. It's going to start breaking apart. So we start a fire here, and the fire is going to propagate through the cracks in the building, which is going to render other floors useless as well, even if the damage might be limited to certain levels in certain floors in the building. So our second test now is we're partnering with the industry on it's a shake table test, 6-story light frame steel gauge building. So we're going to shake it as well, check that, verify the damage, going to set a fire test, a burn test. But this time we're going to inspect it with drone technology to go in quickly afterwards to rapidly assess the damage there. The drones can go in. The technology is such now that they're as good as an eye inspection, quite frankly, from what I've seen, and go in there and do a quick inspection and determine how we can triage these buildings. Can we go back to those buildings rapidly? And also the firefighters that can protect them, we send in the drones first. So that's one of the new projects we'll be working on now. We mentioned earlier the South Napa earthquake. We're starting a workshop next week on recommendations on the lessons learned from the South Napa earthquake. We waited 9 months to do it because I wanted to see what happened after the ground stopped shaking. It's more than just damage. It's recovery. How are the bunnies flowing? What's happened? You know, how's the recovery being affected? How the local government survive? What was the relationship with FEMA, basically? And I can tell you that there's a concern about some of the schools. There's issues on contents and hazardous contents, just like desks, chairs, things on the wall in a school that tends to fall off the wall and move around the building. You know, it tends to always kind of shake towards the door, so children can't get out. So that's one issue I know the Commission is going to focus on. And the second one, Assembly Member, I think is that always personally bothers me is the scammers that show up after an event, a disaster like this. They showed up in Napa in a variety of ways, and we'll be looking at that. So what worries me is you have a big event that Dr. Jones has described. The disaster is going to continue on those victims because they're going to be exploited by bad people, quite frankly. So we're going to try and identify some of the issues there and see if we can make some recommendations to you. We're working with NASA and the Jet Propulsion Lab to try to bring in some new technologies to see. They're sweeping the NASA facilities to find out what's available. We'll have a report on that in May about what we think can apply to help us recover, identify hazards, and recover after the event. And also, Ms. Curry will be talking about the state's earthquake early warning efforts. The Commission is supporting Cal OES on a survey of the user community, which I think is very important about what they think an earthquake early warning system should be. We need that input now, early on, before we continue on with maybe a lot of financial investment. We want to hear from the industry and from the user community too. So we'll be getting that hopefully within 6 months. So as we conclude by recently the Commission received a resolution from the Assembly marking its 40th anniversary, and since the majority of the Commission represents the public, they especially appreciate being recognized by the legislature for the work. And we're open to suggestions from you, the legislature, any member through Assembly Member Cooley in the Assembly about projects that you would need help on or assistance on. We're certainly open to that. Same thing in the Senate as well. So I'm available for any questions you might have.